The sun beat down on the ridge like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil, and Xander Voss wiped the sweat from his brow as he surveyed the cracked earth beneath his boots, knowing in his bones that this land held nothing but dust and death. He had lived in these Utah mountains for 8 years, since 1867, when the war had finally released its grip on his soul and sent him wandering west until he could wander no more. The ridge above Circleville had become his territory, his domain, and he knew every rock, every twisted juniper, every patch of scrub grass that somehow survived in this unforgiving landscape. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick with muscle from years of hauling timber and hunting game, his dark hair falling past his collar in waves that he tied back with a strip of leather when the work demanded it. His hands were calloused, his face weathered, and his eyes held the kind of certainty that came from a life spent reading the land and surviving its moods. The woman who stood before him now, small and determined with auburn hair pinned beneath a dusty bonnet, looked at him like he had just told her the sky was green instead of blue. "Mr. Voss, I appreciate your opinion, but I intend to dig here regardless," she said, her voice carrying a hint of Eastern refinement that seemed wholly out of place in this wild country. "My father was a dowser, and I learned from the best." Xander crossed his arms over his chest, the muscles in his forearms flexing as he tried to contain his frustration. "Miss Kellerman, I have been on this ridge in every season for near a decade. There is no water here. You will waste your time and energy and likely hurt yourself in the process." Fiona Kellerman was 22 years old, and she had not traveled all the way from Pennsylvania to be told what she could and could not do by a mountain man who thought he knew everything about this patch of earth. She had arrived in Circleville 3 weeks ago with her aunt, who had promptly taken ill with a fever that kept her bedridden at the boarding house. Fiona had been forced to find work, and the only position available had been with the new irrigation company that was trying to bring water to the struggling farms below the ridge. They needed someone willing to survey the land, and Fiona had convinced them she had the skills her father had taught her before his death 2 years prior. "I will start digging this afternoon," she said firmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "If you want to help, you are welcome to do so. If not, I suggest you move along and let me work." Xander felt something shift in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation that had nothing to do with annoyance and everything to do with the way she stood her ground despite being half his size. She barely reached his shoulder, but she held herself like someone who had fought battles of her own and won. Her dress was practical, a faded blue cotton that had seen better days, and her boots were scuffed and dusty. She wore no jewelry, no adornments, just a simple determination that radiated from her like heat from a stove. "You will kill yourself out here," he said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "The sun alone will drop you before you dig 2 feet. "Then I suppose I should get started before it gets any hotter," she replied, and turned away from him to examine the small surveying equipment she had brought up the ridge on a borrowed mule. Xander stood there for a long moment, watching her move with efficiency and purpose, and then he cursed under his breath and walked back to his cabin. He told himself he did not care what happened to the stubborn woman, that she would learn her lesson soon enough and go back to wherever she came from. But as he sat on his porch that afternoon, carving a new handle for his axe, his eyes kept drifting to the ridge where he could see her small figure bent over a shovel, digging into the hard, packed earth. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, he could not stand it anymore. He grabbed a canteen of water and a second shovel from his shed and made his way back up the ridge. Fiona was still digging, her face flushed and sweat-soaked, her movements slower than they had been hours before. She had removed her bonnet, and her auburn hair clung to her neck in damp tendrils. "You are a fool," he said as he approached, and she looked up at him with exhausted defiance. "Most likely," she agreed, and then went back to digging. Xander thrust the canteen at her. "Drink, before you collapse." She hesitated, pride warring with thirst, and then took the canteen with a small nod of thanks. She drank deeply, water spilling down her chin, and when she handed it back to him, their fingers brushed. The contact was brief, but Xander felt it like a spark of static electricity. "How deep have you gotten?" he asked, examining the hole she had dug. "About 2 feet, I think," Fiona said, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "I know what you are thinking, that I am wasting my time." "I am thinking that you are more determined than any person I have ever met," he said honestly. "And that if you are going to insist on doing this, you should at least have help so you do not die in the process." Fiona looked at him with surprise, and then something softer entered her expression. "You would help me, even though you think I am wrong." "I would help you because I think you are wrong," he said. "When you find nothing but more dirt, at least you can say you gave it your best effort, and I can say I tried to warn you." A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, the first real smile he had seen from her. "Fair enough, Mr. Voss." "Xander," he corrected. "If we are going to dig together, you might as well use my name." "Fiona," she said in return, and held out her dirty hand. He took it, his large hand engulfing hers, and they shook on it like partners entering a business arrangement. But there was something more in that handshake, something neither of them could have named but both of them felt. They dug until darkness made it impossible to see, and then Xander insisted on walking her back to town. The path down the ridge was treacherous in the dark, and Fiona did not argue. She was exhausted, every muscle in her body screaming, but there was also a satisfaction in the work she had done. Xander carried both shovels over his shoulder like they weighed nothing, and led the way with the confidence of someone who could navigate these mountains blindfolded. "Why did you come here?" he asked as they walked. "To Utah, I mean. This is not exactly a place people come to unless they have a reason." "My aunt married a man from Circleville," Fiona explained. "When my father died, she was my only family left. She invited me to come west and start fresh. I thought it would be an adventure." "And is it?" Fiona laughed, a tired sound. "It is certainly different from Philadelphia. I thought I knew hard work, but I had no idea what hard work really meant until I came here." "What did you do in Philadelphia?" "I taught school," she said. "Young children, mostly. But after my father died, the school board decided they needed a man for the position. They told me I should focus on finding a husband instead of filling my head with books and ideas." Xander heard the bitterness in her voice and understood it. "So you came west to prove them wrong." "Something like that," Fiona admitted. "I wanted to prove that I could do something meaningful, something that mattered. My father always said that water was life and that finding it was a sacred calling. I wanted to honor his memory by using what he taught me." They reached the edge of town, where the scattered buildings of Circleville huddled together against the vast emptiness of the desert beyond. Lanterns glowed in windows, and the sound of a piano drifted from the saloon on the main street. "I will meet you at dawn," Xander said as they stopped in front of the boarding house where Fiona was staying. "We will dig until we hit bedrock or water, whichever comes first." "You really do not have to do this," Fiona said, but there was hope in her voice. "I know," he said. "But I am going to anyway." She smiled up at him, and in the lamplight from the boarding house window he could see flecks of gold in her hazel eyes. "Thank you, Xander." He nodded and turned away before he could do something foolish like tell her she was beautiful even covered in dirt and sweat. He walked back toward his cabin, his mind churning with thoughts he had not allowed himself to have in years. He had sworn off women after the war, after seeing what love and loss could do to a man. He had built his life around solitude and self-reliance, and he had been content with that. Or at least, he had thought he was content. Now, as he lay in his bed listening to the wind whistle through the pines outside his cabin, he could not stop thinking about the determined set of Fiona's jaw, the way she had refused to give up even when her body was clearly begging for rest, the brightness in her eyes when she talked about her father and his teachings. He told himself it was just admiration for her stubborn spirit, nothing more. But deep down, he knew he was lying to himself. The next morning arrived with the pale gray light of pre-dawn, and Xander was already at the dig site when Fiona arrived on her borrowed mule. She looked tired but resolute, wearing the same faded dress and carrying a small basket with what he assumed was food for the day. "You look like you did not sleep," he observed as she climbed down from the mule. "I could say the same about you," she replied, taking in the shadows under his eyes. They both smiled at that, a moment of shared understanding, and then got to work. Xander took the first shift digging while Fiona removed the dirt he loosened, piling it carefully to the side. They worked in companionable silence, the only sounds the bite of the shovel into earth and their breathing. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became oppressive, but they took turns, one resting while the other worked, passing the canteen back and forth. By midday, they had reached 3 feet deep, and Xander was certain they would find nothing. The earth was as dry as it had been at the surface, showing no signs of moisture. He was about to say something when Fiona, who had taken over the digging, suddenly stopped and knelt down. "Wait," she said, her voice tight with excitement. "Feel this." Xander climbed down into the hole beside her, and she guided his hand to the bottom where she had just been digging. The earth there was different, slightly cooler, and when he pressed his palm against it, he felt the barest hint of dampness. It could just be condensation from the temperature change, he said, but his heart was beating faster. Or it could be water, Fiona said, looking at him with shining eyes. "We need to keep going." They dug with renewed energy, and as they went deeper, the dampness became more pronounced. At 4 feet, the earth was visibly darker, and at 5 feet, water began to seep into the bottom of the hole. Fiona let out a cry of triumph and turned to Xander, her face radiant with joy. "I told you," she exclaimed. "I told you there was water here." Xander stared at the water pooling around their boots, unable to believe what he was seeing. He had been so certain, so absolutely convinced that this ridge held no water. He had lived here for 8 years and never suspected that life-giving moisture existed just beneath the surface. And this slip of a woman who had been here less than a month had proven him wrong. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine wonder. Fiona's expression softened. "My father taught me to read the land, not the surface but what lies beneath, the way certain plants grow even when they look dead, the way the air feels in certain spots, the temperature variations in the soil. It is not magic, just observation and intuition." "It might as well be magic," Xander said, and then, without thinking, he reached out and pulled her into his arms. Fiona stiffened in surprise, and then relaxed into the embrace, her arms coming up to wrap around his waist. They stood there in the bottom of the hole, muddy and exhausted, holding each other as water seeped around their feet. Xander could feel her heart racing against his chest, could smell the scent of her hair despite the dirt and sweat. He pulled back slightly to look at her face, and what he saw there made his breath catch. She was looking at him with the same wonder he felt, the same dawning realization that something had shifted between them, something that could not be undone. "Fiona," he said, his voice rough. "Yes." She whispered. He wanted to kiss her, wanted it more than he had wanted anything in years, but he also knew that this was not the right moment. They were standing in a hole in the ground, filthy and exhausted, and she deserved better than a desperate kiss born of excitement and proximity. "We should get you back to town," he said instead. "You need to tell the irrigation company what you found. This is going to change everything for Circleville." Fiona nodded, but he could see disappointment flicker across her face, and he knew she had been hoping for something different. They climbed out of the hole and gathered their tools, and as they made their way back down the ridge, Xander found himself walking closer to her than strictly necessary, their shoulders brushing with each step. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The irrigation company sent men up to the ridge to confirm Fiona's findings and begin the process of developing the spring. The town council held an emergency meeting to discuss how the new water source would be distributed to the farms. Fiona was hailed as a hero, and the company gave her a generous bonus payment that would allow her to stay in Circleville as long as she needed to care for her aunt. Through it all, Xander found himself drawn to her like a compass needle to true north. He helped with the water development, using his knowledge of the land to guide the irrigation company's workers. He brought fresh game to the boarding house for Fiona and her aunt. He made excuses to see her, to talk to her, to simply be in her presence. Fiona seemed equally drawn to him. She would seek him out during the day, ostensibly to ask his opinion on some aspect of the water project, but they both knew it was more than that. They would talk for hours, about everything and nothing, and Xander found himself sharing things he had never told another soul. He told her about the war, about the friends he had lost, about the nightmares that still woke him some nights. She listened without judgment, her hand sometimes finding his, offering comfort without words. 2 weeks after they found the water, Xander finally worked up the courage to ask her to dinner. Not at the boarding house or the saloon, but at his cabin. He wanted to cook for her, to show her his home, to have her in his space without the eyes of the town watching. Fiona accepted immediately, her face lighting up with that smile that made his chest feel tight. He spent the entire day preparing, cleaning his cabin more thoroughly than he ever had, cooking a venison roast with wild herbs and the last of his potatoes. He even picked wildflowers from the meadow near his cabin, arranging them awkwardly in a tin cup on his rough-hewn table. When Fiona arrived as the sun was setting, riding up on her mule with a basket of fresh bread she had baked, Xander felt his mouth go dry. She had changed into a different dress, a soft green that brought out the color in her eyes, and she had left her hair down, the auburn waves cascading over her shoulders. "You look beautiful," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. Fiona blushed, a pretty pink coloring her cheeks. "Thank you. Your cabin is lovely." It was not lovely by any stretch of the imagination, just a simple one-room structure with a stone fireplace, a bed in one corner, and a table with 2 chairs. But she said it like she meant it, and Xander felt a surge of pride. They ate dinner as the last light faded from the sky, and then sat on his porch watching the stars emerge. The night was cool, a welcome relief from the heat of the day, and Xander fetched a blanket to drape over Fiona's shoulders. "I never get tired of this sky," she said softly, gazing up at the vast expanse of stars. "In Philadelphia, you could barely see them because of all the smoke and lights, but here, it is like you could reach up and touch them." "I know what you mean," Xander said. "When I first came here, I would spend entire nights just sitting and watching the sky. It made me feel small, but in a good way. Like my problems did not matter as much as I thought they did." Fiona turned to look at him. "What were your problems, if you do not mind me asking?" Xander was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I was angry when I came here. Angry about the war, about the things I had seen and done, about the way the world seemed to make no sense. I thought if I could get far enough away from everything, the anger would fade. And it did, eventually. But it was replaced by loneliness. "Are you still lonely?" Fiona asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Xander looked at her, at the way the starlight caught in her hair, at the earnest concern in her eyes. "Not anymore," he said. "Not since you showed up and proved me wrong about that ridge." Fiona laughed softly. "I am glad my stubborn refusal to listen to you brought you something good." "It brought me you," Xander said, and then reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered on her cheek, and she leaned into his touch. "Xander," she said, and there was so much emotion packed into his name that he felt it like a physical weight. "I know I am not what you expected when you came west," he said. "I am just a mountain man with nothing to offer but a rough cabin and a rougher life. But I care about you, Fiona. More than I thought I could care about anyone." "You are exactly what I did not know I needed," Fiona said, reaching up to cover his hand with hers. "You are strong and kind, and you see me as more than just a woman who should be content to sit quietly and do as she is told. You let me be myself, and you do not try to change me." "Why would I want to change you?" Xander asked. "You are perfect as you are." Fiona's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "No one has ever said that to me before." Xander moved closer, his free hand coming up to cup her other cheek, holding her face gently between his large, calloused palms. "Then they were fools," he said, and finally, he kissed her. It was a gentle kiss at first, tentative and exploring, but when Fiona sighed against his mouth and her hands came up to grip his shirt, pulling him closer, it deepened into something more intense. Xander felt like he was drowning and flying at the same time, every nerve ending alive with sensation. He had kissed women before, but never like this, never with this feeling of rightness, of coming home. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Fiona rested her forehead against his chest. "I was beginning to think you would never do that," she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "I was trying to be a gentleman," Xander admitted, "but I have been wanting to kiss you since the day you told me you were going to dig on that ridge whether I approved or not." Fiona laughed and tilted her head back to look at him. "Really? That long? You were magnificent," he said seriously. "Standing there covered in dust, telling a man twice your size that you did not need his permission or approval. I thought you were the bravest person I had ever met." "Or the most foolish," Fiona said, but she was smiling. "Bravery and foolishness often look the same," Xander said, and kissed her again. They stayed on the porch until the night grew too cold to ignore, and then Xander reluctantly told Fiona he should take her back to town. He did not want to compromise her reputation, and he knew that if she stayed any longer, he would not want to let her go. As he walked her back down the mountain, leading her mule while she walked beside him, their hands clasped together, Xander felt a contentment he had never known. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for so many years had vanished, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with the woman beside him. Over the following weeks, Xander and Fiona became inseparable. He would meet her in town each morning, and they would spend their days together, sometimes working on the irrigation project, sometimes simply exploring the surrounding countryside. Xander showed her his favorite places in the mountains, secret meadows filled with wildflowers, hidden waterfalls, caves with ancient paintings on the walls. Fiona soaked it all in with the enthusiasm of someone discovering a whole new world. She also introduced him to parts of himself he had forgotten existed. She encouraged him to talk about his past, not just the painful parts but the good memories too. She made him laugh with stories about her students in Philadelphia and her father's quirky habits. She challenged him intellectually, debating everything from politics to philosophy to the best way to cook rabbit stew. Fiona's aunt recovered from her illness and was delighted by the obvious affection between her niece and the mountain man. She had worried that Fiona would never find anyone who could match her spirit and intelligence, but Xander clearly fit the bill. She gave them her blessing without being asked, and made sure to be conveniently absent whenever Xander came to call. The town of Circleville was also pleased with the match. The irrigation project was transforming the struggling farms into productive land, and everyone knew it was thanks to Fiona's skills and Xander's assistance. They were seen as a team, two halves of a whole, and the town embraced them as such. One evening in late summer, Xander took Fiona back up to the ridge where she had found the water. The spring was now fully developed, with a small dam and pipes leading down to the valley below. It was a testament to what determination and hard work could accomplish, and Xander felt a swell of pride every time he looked at it. "I have been thinking," he said as they sat on a flat rock overlooking the valley, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "About what?" Fiona asked, leaning against his shoulder. "About the future," Xander said. "About what I want my life to look like, and the only thing I can see clearly is you." Fiona sat up and turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "What are you saying?" Xander reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. He had carved it himself over the past week, working late into the night by lamplight, trying to get every detail perfect. He opened it to reveal a simple silver ring with a small turquoise stone set in the center. "I am saying that I love you, Fiona Kellerman," he said, his voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. "I love your courage and your determination and the way you see the world. I love how you proved me wrong about that ridge and about so many other things. I love how you make me want to be a better man, and I am asking if you would do me the honor of becoming my wife." Fiona's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling the biggest smile he had ever seen. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you, Xander Voss. I love you too, more than I can put into words." Xander slipped the ring onto her finger and then pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the love and promise he felt. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, bearing witness to their commitment. They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Circleville. Fiona wore a white dress that her aunt had helped her sew, and Xander wore his best clothes, his long dark hair neatly tied back. The entire town turned out for the wedding, cramming into the small church until people were standing along the walls and spilling out onto the porch. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Xander kissed Fiona with such tenderness that several of the women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The celebration afterward went on until late into the night, with music and dancing and more food than Xander had seen in one place since before the war. As the festivities wound down, Xander and Fiona slipped away and rode up to his cabin, which was now their cabin. Xander had spent the past weeks making improvements, adding a real glass window, building a larger table and more shelves, even constructing a small addition that would serve as a proper bedroom. "Welcome home, Mrs. Voss," he said as he lifted her down from her horse, something he had insisted on buying for her as a wedding gift. "It feels like home already," Fiona said, looking around with delight. "But that is because home is wherever you are." They spent their wedding night wrapped in each other's arms, learning the contours of each other's bodies with gentle exploration and growing passion. Xander had never felt so complete, so utterly at peace. Fiona was everything he had not known he was searching for, and as he held her afterward, listening to her breathing even out in sleep, He sent up a silent prayer of thanks to whatever force had brought her into his life. The first year of their marriage was filled with joy and hard work. They expanded the cabin, adding a kitchen area and a front room with a real stove that Xander had hauled up from Salt Lake City. Fiona continued to consult on water projects throughout the region, her reputation spreading to neighboring towns. Xander worked as a guide and hunter, using his knowledge of the mountains to help settlers find good land and safe passage. They also worked together on a project that became Fiona's passion, developing more water sources in the arid landscape around Circleville. She would survey potential sites, and Xander would help her dig and develop them. They found 3 more springs in that first year, each one bringing hope and prosperity to struggling farms. In the evenings, they would sit on their porch and talk about their dreams for the future. Fiona wanted to write a book about water surveying techniques, sharing her father's knowledge with a wider audience. Xander wanted to start a lumber business, harvesting timber from the mountains in a sustainable way. But more than anything, they both wanted a family. It was in the spring of their second year of marriage that Fiona told Xander she was pregnant. He had just returned from a week-long hunting trip, and she met him at the door with glowing eyes and a smile that lit up her entire face. "I have news," she said, taking his hands. "Good news, I hope," Xander said, though he could tell from her expression that it was. "The very best news," Fiona confirmed. "We are going to have a baby." Xander felt his knees go weak, and he sat down heavily on the porch step, pulling Fiona down beside him. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Very certain," she said. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday. We should have a baby by late October." Xander pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as if she might break. "I am going to be a father," he said wonderingly. "We are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Fiona asked, though she seemed to already know the answer. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Xander said. "I am terrified and thrilled and so grateful I can barely think straight." Fiona laughed and kissed him. "That is exactly how I feel." The months of Fiona's pregnancy were both wonderful and nerve-wracking for Xander. He hovered over her constantly, worried about every twinge and discomfort. Fiona bore his overprotectiveness with good humor, though she did have to firmly tell him that she was pregnant, not an invalid, and she could still do most of her normal activities. As her belly grew round and her movements became more awkward, Xander took over more of the physical labor around their home. He would not let her lift anything heavy or climb ladders or do any of the dozen other things he deemed too dangerous. Fiona would roll her eyes but secretly appreciated his care. On a cool October evening, Fiona's labor began. Xander immediately rode down to town to fetch the midwife, a capable older woman named Martha who had delivered half the babies in Circleville. He then spent the next 12 hours pacing outside the bedroom while Martha and Fiona's aunt tended to his wife. Every cry from Fiona made him want to break down the door, but Martha had strictly forbidden him from entering until the baby was born. He wore a path in the floorboards with his pacing, his heart racing every time he heard a sound from the other room. Finally, just as dawn was breaking, he heard a new sound, the thin, reedy cry of a newborn baby. Xander's heart leaped into his throat and he rushed to the bedroom door just as Martha opened it. "You have a son," she said with a tired smile. "A healthy, strong boy, and your wife is doing well." Xander barely heard the last part as he pushed past her into the room. Fiona was propped up against the pillows, her hair damp with sweat and her face pale with exhaustion, but she had never looked more beautiful. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in blankets, and as Xander approached, she pulled back the fabric to reveal a red-faced baby with a shock of dark hair. "Meet your son," Fiona said softly. Xander sat carefully on the edge of the bed and reached out with trembling hands to touch the baby's tiny fingers. They immediately curled around his index finger with surprising strength. "He is perfect," Xander whispered, his voice breaking. "You are both perfect. We did well, did we not?" Fiona said with a tired smile. "You did all the work," Xander said. "I just paced and worried." "Your pacing was very supportive," Fiona teased and then grew more serious. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at his son's face, Xander knew exactly what felt right. "Thomas," he said, "after your father, so he can carry on his legacy." Tears spilled down Fiona's cheeks. "Thomas Voss," she said. "It is perfect." Xander carefully took the baby from Fiona's arms, cradling him with surprising gentleness for such a large man. He stood and walked to the window, showing his son the sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Welcome to the world, Thomas," he said quietly. "I promise to protect you and love you and teach you everything I know. And your mother will teach you even more than that, about courage and determination and how to find water in the desert." Thomas yawned, utterly unconcerned with his father's promises, and Fiona laughed from the bed. "I think he is more interested in food than philosophy right now." Xander returned the baby to Fiona's arms and watched as she began to nurse him, marveling at how natural it seemed. This was his family, he thought with wonder. This woman he loved and this tiny person they had created together. He had gone from a lonely mountain man to a husband and father, and the transformation felt both surreal and absolutely right. The first months of Thomas's life were exhausting but joyful. Xander threw himself into fatherhood with the same intensity he brought to everything else, changing diapers and walking the floor with a crying baby at all hours of the night. He built a cradle with his own hands, carving it with intricate designs of mountains and streams and trees. He sang old war songs to his son. The words changed to remove the violence and leave only the melodies. Fiona recovered her strength and returned to her water surveying work, though now she brought Thomas with her in a sling across her chest. She would study the land while the baby slept against her heart, and Xander would help her dig when promising sites were found. They were a team in every sense of the word, balancing parenting and work, and their relationship with practiced ease. As Thomas grew from an infant to a toddler, Xander found himself constantly amazed by the little person his son was becoming. The boy had his mother's curiosity and fearlessness, combined with his father's physical strength and love of the outdoors. By the time Thomas was 2, he was already following Xander around like a shadow, wanting to help with every task no matter how unsuited to a toddler it might be. It was around this time that Fiona discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news was met with excited confidence rather than nervous uncertainty. They knew what to expect, and they were ready to expand their family. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1873, on a day when the wildflowers were blooming across the meadows, and the air smelled of pine and fresh earth. The labor was shorter and easier than Thomas's birth, and when Xander was finally allowed into the bedroom, he found Fiona sitting up and looking remarkably energetic, holding a tiny baby girl with auburn hair. "She looks just like you," Xander said in wonder, sitting beside them. "She has your nose," Fiona pointed out with a smile. "Poor thing," Xander joked, and Fiona swatted his arm. They named her Rose after the wild roses that grew near their cabin, and she quickly proved to have a personality as vibrant as her name suggested. Where Thomas had been a quiet, observant baby, Rose was loud and demanding, making her presence known from the very start. Thomas, now a protective older brother at nearly 3 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister. He would bring her rocks and sticks and wildflowers, convinced these were appropriate gifts for an infant. Xander and Fiona would gently redirect him, but they cherished his sweet attempts to care for Rose. The years passed in a blur of activity and growth. Xander's lumber business became successful, providing a steady income that allowed them to improve their home even further. Fiona published her book on water surveying in 1875, and it was well received by agricultural communities throughout the West. She received requests to consult on projects as far away as Nevada and Colorado, though she usually turned them down, preferring to stay close to home and her growing children. Thomas and Rose grew into intelligent, capable children who loved the mountains as much as their parents did. Thomas was serious and thoughtful, always watching and learning, while Rose was adventurous and bold, climbing trees and exploring caves with fearless enthusiasm. Together, they were a handful, but Xander and Fiona would not have had it any other way. In 1876, when Thomas was 6 and Rose was 3, Fiona became pregnant for a third time. This pregnancy was harder on her body than the previous 2, and Xander worried constantly. He insisted she rest more, take on fewer projects, let him handle more of the household work. Fiona agreed, knowing he needed to feel like he was doing something to help. Their second son was born in the winter of 1877, during a snowstorm that blocked the mountain passes and made it impossible to get the midwife from town. Xander delivered the baby himself, with only Fiona's aunt there to assist and his own shaking hands to guide him. It was the most terrifying experience of his life, but when he finally held his newborn son and heard Fiona's exhausted but triumphant laugh, he knew they had made it through. They named him Daniel, and he proved to be a perfect blend of his older siblings, combining Thomas's quiet observation with Rose's adventurous spirit. The cabin was now bursting with energy and noise, and Xander had to add yet another room to accommodate their growing family. As the children grew, Xander made sure to teach them everything he knew about surviving in the mountains. Thomas learned to track animals and read weather patterns. Rose became an expert at identifying plants, both edible and poisonous. Daniel, as soon as he was old enough, proved to have a natural talent for understanding the land itself. Much like his mother, Fiona taught all 3 children to read and write, using books she ordered from back east. She also taught them about water, about how to find it and protect it and use it wisely. The children absorbed it all like sponges, and both Xander and Fiona could see that their legacy would continue through their offspring. One evening in the summer of 1880, when Thomas was 9, Rose was 7, and Daniel was 3, the family sat together on their expanded porch watching the sunset. The children were tired from a day of exploring, leaning against their parents with drowsy contentment. Xander had his arm around Fiona and she rested her head on his shoulder. "You ever miss Philadelphia?" Xander asked quietly. Fiona was silent for a moment, considering the question. "Sometimes I miss the ease of it," she said honestly. "The convenience of having shops nearby and not having to haul water or worry about bears in the yard. But I do not miss the person I was there. That Fiona was small and constrained, living a life that other people had decided for her. Here, I get to be fully myself. I get to use my skills and raise my children in a place where they can grow strong and free. And I get to share it all with you." She turned to kiss him softly, and Xander felt the same swell of love and gratitude he had felt on their wedding night, only deeper now, tempered by years of partnership and shared experiences. "I never thought I would have this," he said, gesturing to the cabin, the children, the land spread out before them. "I thought I would spend my life alone, and I had made peace with that. But then you showed up and insisted on digging where I was certain there was no water, and you changed everything. It turns out there is water in a lot of unexpected places, Fiona said with a smile. You just have to know where to look. And be stubborn enough to keep digging, Xander added. That too, Fiona agreed. Thomas looked up at them from where he was sitting. Tell us the story again, he requested, about how Mother found the water on the ridge. It was a story the children never tired of hearing, the tale of how their parents met and fell in love. Xander and Fiona exchanged amused glances, and then Xander began the familiar narrative. Your mother arrived in Circleville in the summer of 1869, he said. I saw her riding up the ridge on a borrowed mule, looking determined and completely out of place in the wilderness. I told her there was no water up there, that she was wasting her time. But did she listen? No, the children chorused, even Daniel, who could barely follow the story. That is right, Xander continued. She told me she was going to dig anyway and that I could either help or get out of her way. So I did the only sensible thing and helped her dig. And do you know what happened? She found water, Rose exclaimed. She did indeed, Xander confirmed. She dug 3 feet and found water that I swore was not there. She proved me wrong, and in doing so she changed my life forever. Because then you fell in love, Thomas said knowingly. Because then I fell in love, Xander agreed, pulling Fiona closer. And I have been grateful every day since. The children seemed satisfied with this retelling, and as darkness fell, Xander and Fiona herded them inside for bedtime. After the children were tucked into their beds and the cabin was quiet, Xander and Fiona sat together by the fireplace. I was thinking, Fiona said, staring into the flames. That ridge where I found the water where we first met, I want to make sure it is protected. The spring has been so important to Circleville, to all the farms in the valley. I want to make certain it stays that way for future generations. What did you have in mind? Xander asked. I thought we could buy the land around the spring, Fiona said. Turn it into a protected area that cannot be developed or sold off. Keep it as a water source for the community in perpetuity. Xander considered this. They had saved enough money from his lumber business and her consulting work that they could afford to purchase the land. And it made sense to protect the place that had brought them together and provided so much benefit to the town. I think that is a wonderful idea, he said. We should do it. Over the next few months, they made arrangements to purchase the ridge land from the territorial government. It took some negotiating and no small amount of paperwork, but by the end of 1880, they owned the land surrounding the spring. They worked with the town council to draft an agreement that would keep the water accessible to the community while protecting the source from contamination or overuse. The townspeople were deeply grateful, recognizing the gift for what it was, an investment in their collective future. At a town meeting, the mayor proposed naming the spring after Fiona, calling it Kellerman Spring in honor of her skills and generosity. Fiona was touched, but insisted that if they were going to name it after anyone, it should be named for both of them. Voss Spring, she suggested, because my husband worked just as hard to develop it as I did to find it. The compromise was agreed upon, and Voss Spring became an official landmark, marked with a stone monument that Xander carved himself. On it, he inscribed the date the water was found and a simple message. Persistence reveals what patience overlooks. As the years continued to pass, Xander and Fiona's family became a fixture in Circleville. They were respected members of the community, known for their hard work, their generosity, and their devotion to each other and their children. The cabin on the mountain, which had started as a simple bachelor's dwelling, had grown into a proper homestead with multiple rooms, a large barn and gardens that Fiona tended with the same care she brought to her water projects. Thomas grew into a tall, serious young man who combined his father's physical strength with his mother's intellectual curiosity. He took over much of the lumber business as he got older, implementing sustainable harvesting practices that ensured the forests would remain healthy for generations. Rose became a teacher, though not in the traditional sense. She would travel to remote homesteads and teach children who had no access to regular schools, riding her horse through all kinds of weather with books and supplies in her saddlebags. She had her mother's determination and her father's love of the wilderness, and she thrived in the role. Daniel, true to his early promise, developed an almost supernatural ability to find water. By the time he was 16, he was consulting on projects throughout Utah and beyond, carrying on his mother's work and expanding on her techniques. He also fell in love with a quiet girl from a neighboring ranch, and Xander and Fiona watched with delight as their youngest son experienced the same overwhelming emotion they had felt for each other. In 1889, 20 years after Xander and Fiona first met, they stood together on the ridge above their home, looking out at the valley below. They were older now, with silver threading through their hair and lines etched on their faces by sun and laughter. But they still held hands like newlyweds, still looked at each other with the same love and wonder they had felt that first night on Xander's porch. "You remember the day we met?" Fiona asked, though she knew he remembered every detail as clearly as she did. "I remember thinking you were the most stubborn woman I had ever encountered," Xander said with a smile, "and that you were going to get yourself killed by heat stroke or sheer pig-headedness. I remember thinking you were an arrogant know-it-all who needed to be proven wrong," Fiona replied. "And then you helped me dig anyway, even though you thought I was crazy." "Best decision I ever made," Xander said, pulling her close. They stood in silence for a while, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and red. The valley below was green and thriving, transformed by the water that Fiona had found and Xander had helped develop. Circleville had grown from a struggling outpost to a prosperous town, and they had played no small part in that transformation. "We did well, did we not?" Fiona said, echoing the words she had spoken when Thomas was born. "We did more than well," Xander said. "We built something that will last, not just the spring or the land or the business, but our family. Our children are good people, Fiona, strong and capable and kind. That is our real legacy." "They got all of that from you," Fiona said. "They got it from both of us," Xander corrected. "You taught them to be persistent and to think for themselves. You showed them that determination and intelligence are just as valuable as physical strength. And you loved them fiercely enough that they will always know what real love looks like." Fiona felt tears prick her eyes. "We were lucky to find each other," she said. "Luck had nothing to do with it," Xander said. "You came looking for water and you found it. You dug 3 feet in a place I swore was bone dry, and you proved that sometimes the most valuable things are hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for someone brave enough to search for them." "Are we still talking about water?" Fiona asked with a teasing smile. "We are talking about everything," Xander said. "Water and love and life and all the ways they are connected. You found water in the desert, Fiona, but you also found something in me I did not know was there. The capacity to love again, to hope again, to build a life worth living." Fiona turned in his arms to face him fully. "You did the same for me. I came west running away from a life that did not fit, and I found a place where I could finally be myself. I found purpose and meaning and a love that has sustained me through everything. You gave me that, Xander. You and this wild, beautiful place." They kissed as the sun dipped below the horizon, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built a life together through hard work, determination, and unwavering love. The ridge where they stood had been the beginning of their story, the place where Fiona had proven that miracles could be found in the most unlikely places if you were willing to dig deep enough. As full darkness fell and stars began to appear in the vast Utah sky, they made their way back down to their home. Lights glowed in the windows, and they could hear laughter from inside, where their children and growing grandchildren had gathered for dinner. It was the sound of family, of continuity, of love passed down through generations. Xander opened the door and ushered Fiona inside, following her into the warmth and light. Thomas was playing with his young daughter while his wife set the table. Rose was regaling everyone with a story from her teaching travels, her expressive hands painting pictures in the air. Daniel sat with his new bride, their heads close together as they discussed something in quiet tones. Everyone looked up as Xander and Fiona entered, and the room seemed to brighten even further. "There you are," Thomas said. "We were about to start without you." "You would not dare," Xander said with mock severity, and everyone laughed. They gathered around the expanded table that Xander had built years ago to accommodate their growing family. The children had all contributed to the meal, bringing dishes they had made in their own homes. It was a chaotic, joyful affair, with multiple conversations happening at once and little ones getting passed from lap to lap. As they ate, Fiona looked around the table at the faces of the people she loved most in the world. This was what she had hoped for all those years ago when she had boarded a train heading west, though she could never have imagined the specific shape her life would take. She had wanted meaning and purpose and a chance to use her skills. She had found all of that and so much more. After dinner, as the others cleaned up and settled the children for the night, Xander and Fiona slipped outside onto the porch one more time. It had become their habit over the years, this quiet moment at the end of the day where they could simply be together without demands or distractions. "I have been thinking about something," Fiona said as they sat in their customary spot, wrapped in a blanket against the cool mountain air. "What is that?" Xander asked, his arm around her shoulders. "About how much has changed since we met," Fiona said. "Not just for us, but for everything. When I came here, this was still a territory, wild and unsettled. Now there are towns and farms and railroads. The world is becoming more civilized." "Does that bother you?" Xander asked. "Not bother exactly," Fiona said thoughtfully, "but it makes me think about what we are leaving behind. I want to make sure that some of this wildness remains, that our grandchildren and their children will still be able to experience the kind of beauty and freedom that brought us together." "That is why we protected the spring," Xander reminded her. "And why Thomas is managing the forest sustainably. We are doing what we can to preserve this place." "I know," Fiona said, "but I think we should do more. I want to write down our story, not in a romantic way, but as a practical guide. How we found water, how we developed it, how we protected it. I want future generations to understand that resources are precious and need to be managed carefully." "That sounds like another book," Xander said with a smile. "Perhaps it is," Fiona agreed. "Will you help me write it? Your perspective is just as important as mine." "Of course I will help you," Xander said. "We have always been a team." And so, in the months that followed, Xander and Fiona embarked on one more project together. They spent long evenings writing and revising, recording not just the technical details of water surveying and resource management, but also the human story behind it. They wrote about the importance of listening to the land, of being willing to challenge conventional wisdom, of working together toward common goals. The book was published in 1891 and became widely used by agricultural communities throughout the West. It was practical and accessible, filled with detailed illustrations that Xander had drawn and clear instructions that anyone could follow. but woven throughout was the underlying message of stewardship and respect for the natural world, lessons that Xander and Fiona had learned through decades of living close to the land. By the time they reached their 50s, Xander and Fiona had accomplished more than many people did in multiple lifetimes. They had found water in dry places, built a thriving business, raised 3 successful children, written books that educated and inspired others, and protected land for future generations. But more than any of those achievements, they had built a marriage based on mutual respect, shared values, and a love that had only deepened with time. They celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary in 1894 with a party that brought together friends and family from across the territory. People came from as far away as Salt Lake City to honor the couple who had become legends in their own quiet way. There were speeches and toasts, and more than one person got misty-eyed recounting stories about Xander and Fiona's contributions to the community. Through it all, Xander and Fiona sat together, hands clasped, exchanging private smiles that spoke of shared memories and inside jokes. When it came time to cut the anniversary cake, Xander raised his glass and proposed a toast. "To my wife," he said, his deep voice carrying across the gathered crowd. 25 years ago, she rode up a mountain to dig for water in a place I swore was bone dry. She found that water, and in the process, she found me. She took a lonely mountain man and gave him a family, a purpose, and a reason to believe in miracles. Fiona, you are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I would happily spend another 25 years proving to you just how much I love you." There was not a dry eye in the house as Fiona stood and kissed her husband, and the applause was thunderous. When it was Fiona's turn to speak, she looked out at the assembled crowd and then back at Xander. "My husband is right that I came here looking for water," she said. "But what I found was so much more than that. I found a partner who respected my abilities and supported my dreams. I found a place where I could be fully myself without apology. I found children who have grown into remarkable adults. And I found a love that has sustained me through every challenge and made every triumph sweeter. Xander, you gave me everything I did not know I was searching for. Thank you for digging with me, both literally and metaphorically, and for never giving up on us." The celebration went on late into the night, but eventually, everyone headed home or to their accommodations in town. Xander and Fiona rode back up to their mountain home together, the path so familiar now that their horses could have made it blindfolded. "That was quite a party," Fiona said as they unsaddled the horses and settled them in the barn. "It was," Xander agreed, "though I could have done without all the attention." Fiona laughed. "You handled it beautifully. Your speech made me cry." "I meant every word," Xander said seriously. "You changed my life, Fiona. I was existing before you came along, but I was not really living." They walked hand in hand up to the cabin, and as they reached the porch, Fiona paused to look up at the stars. "Do you remember the night you proposed?" she asked. "We were on the ridge, watching the sunset, and you pulled out that ring you had carved yourself." "I was terrified you would say no," Xander admitted. "I kept thinking, why would this incredible woman want to tie herself to a rough mountain man with nothing to offer but a cabin and a hard life?" "You had everything to offer," Fiona said, turning to face him. "You had integrity and strength and a good heart. You saw me as an equal, not as someone to be managed or controlled. You made me feel valued and respected and loved. That was worth more than all the ease and comfort in the world." Xander cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had started to fall. "I love you more now than I did then," he said, "which I did not think was possible, but every year with you has added layers to that love. The way you mother our children, the way you pursue your passions, The way you age with such grace and continue to challenge me and make me think. You are extraordinary, Fiona Voss. We are extraordinary together, Fiona corrected. That is our secret. Separately, we are good. Together, we are unstoppable. They went inside and prepared for bed, a comfortable routine they had performed thousands of times. But that night, as they lay together in the darkness, Xander held Fiona a little closer, and she pressed a little tighter against him, both of them acutely aware of how precious their time together was. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges but also joys and triumphs. Thomas took over the lumber business completely, allowing Xander to spend more time on other pursuits. Rose married a rancher and had children of her own, continuing her teaching work while raising her family. Daniel established himself as the preeminent water surveyor in the region, with clients throughout the West. Xander and Fiona became the patriarch and matriarch of a growing clan, with grandchildren who adored them and came to visit as often as possible. They told stories about the old days, taught their grandchildren skills that were becoming rare in an increasingly modern world, and passed down the values that had guided their own lives. In 1899, as the century drew to a close, Xander and Fiona made a pilgrimage back to the ridge where they had first met. They climbed slowly now, their bodies no longer as spry as they once were, but they made it to the top and stood looking out at the view that had witnessed the beginning of their love story. Voss Spring still flowed strong, feeding the valley below and providing life to crops and animals and people. The monument Xander had carved 30 years earlier was weathered but still legible, a testament to their persistence and the value of looking beyond surface appearances. 30 years, Fiona said wonderingly. Since I dug 3 feet and found water you swore was not there. Best 3 feet anyone ever dug, Xander said. Changed everything. It really did, Fiona agreed. Not just for us, but for everyone in the valley. That water made this whole community possible. You made it possible, Xander corrected. You had the vision and the skill and the stubbornness to prove that water could be found where everyone said there was none. Fiona leaned against him, and they stood in comfortable silence, watching clouds drift across the sky. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had listened to you that day? She asked. If I had just accepted your word that there was no water and gone home, we would have missed out on the best 30 years of our lives, Xander said simply. I would have stayed a lonely mountain man, and you would have gone back east or found some other town to settle in. We would have lived perfectly adequate lives and never known what we were missing. I cannot imagine a life without you, Fiona said. Even trying feels wrong, like contemplating a world without color or music. Then it is a good thing you did not listen to me, Xander said with a smile. Your stubborn refusal to accept my so-called expertise led to everything good in my life. They made their way back down the ridge as afternoon shadows lengthened, taking their time and stopping frequently to rest. Their bodies might be slower, but their minds were as sharp as ever, and their love was as strong as the mountains that surrounded them. That evening, back at their cabin, they hosted a family dinner that had become a monthly tradition. All 3 of their children came with their own families, filling the house with noise and laughter, and the chaos of multiple generations under one roof. Xander sat at the head of the table with Fiona beside him, watching the organized mayhem with contentment. After dinner, as was his custom, Xander stood and clinked his glass to get everyone's attention. I want to make a toast, he said. To your mother and grandmother, who 30 years ago today found water on a ridge where I swore none existed. She proved me wrong, thank God, and in doing so, she started a chain of events that led to all of you. So here is to Fiona Kellerman Voss, the most stubborn, brilliant, beautiful woman I have ever known. May we all have even a fraction of her determination and vision. To grandmother, the grandchildren chorused, raising their glasses of milk and water. To mother, the children added. Fiona blushed and waved them off. You are all being ridiculous, she said, but she was smiling. I simply dug a hole. Xander helped, and together we found water. That is all. That is everything, Thomas said seriously. That water changed this valley. It allowed farms to flourish and the town to grow. And you and Father built something even more valuable, a family based on love and respect and hard work. We are all grateful. As the evening wore on and families began to depart for their own homes, Xander and Fiona were left alone once more. They cleaned up together, washing dishes and tidying the cabin with the ease of long practice. That was nice, Fiona said as they finished. Having everyone here. It was, Xander agreed. Though I am not sorry to have some quiet now, Fiona laughed. We are getting old, admitting that all that noise exhausts us. We have earned the right to be tired, Xander said. We raised 3 children, built multiple businesses, and changed the landscape of this valley. I think we have done our part. They settled on the porch one last time, wrapped in blankets against the cool evening air. The stars were coming out, the same stars they had watched together for 3 decades, constant and familiar. You have any regrets? Fiona asked suddenly. About the life we built here? Xander considered the question seriously. No, he said finally. Not a single one. Every choice we made, every challenge we faced led us to this moment. I would not change anything, because changing even one small thing might mean losing something precious. Not even those first few months when we were so poor we were eating wild onions and rabbit for every meal, Fiona teased. Not even then, Xander said. Because we were together and we were building something. That was worth more than comfort or ease. Fiona rested her head on his shoulder. I love you, Xander Voss. I loved you when you were a stubborn mountain man who thought he knew everything, and I love you now as a grandfather who actually does know quite a lot. I love you, Fiona Voss, Xander replied. I loved you when you were a determined young woman who refused to take no for an answer. And I love you now as a respected elder who has earned the right to say, I told you so. They sat together as the night deepened. 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that exceeded their wildest dreams. They had found water in the desert, love in loneliness, and purpose in service to others. They had raised children who would carry on their values, and grandchildren who would tell their story to future generations. As they finally made their way inside for the night, Xander paused at the door and looked back at the mountains silhouetted against the starlit sky. Somewhere up there, on a ridge that had once seemed worthless, was a spring that still flowed strong. It was a monument to persistence, to the value of challenging assumptions, and to the miracles that could be found when someone was brave enough to dig beneath the surface. But more than that, it was the place where his life had truly begun, where a stubborn woman with auburn hair and determined eyes had looked at him and said she was going to dig whether he approved or not. And in that moment, though he had not known it yet, his lonely existence as a mountain man had ended and his real life had begun. Xander closed the door behind them and followed Fiona to bed, grateful beyond words for the day she had ridden up that ridge with a shovel and a dream. She had found water where he swore none existed, and in the process, she had found something even more valuable, the key to unlocking a heart he thought had been sealed forever. As he drifted off to sleep with Fiona's steady breathing beside him, Xander's last conscious thought was one of profound gratitude. He had spent the first part of his life wandering, searching for something he could not name. And then Fiona had appeared, dug 3 feet into supposedly barren ground and found not just water but hope, love, and a future neither of them could have imagined. It was the greatest discovery of his life, and every day since had been a gift he never took for granted.